Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the RentPrep for Landlords podcast. This is episode number 402, and I'm your host, Andrew Schultz. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about a landlord fined for having too many tenants in one home, eviction setouts and unresponsive tenants, and how to verify income for veterans. We'll get to all that right after this.
Welcome to the RentPrep for Landlords podcast. Now your host, Andrew Schultz.
Have you joined the free RentPrep for Landlords Facebook group? Our group members get access to our Sherwin-Williams and PPG paint discount programs, can ask questions in our monthly AMA sessions, and if you have a question or a situation that you've never encountered before or just need to bounce an idea off a group of over 13,000 housing providers, this is the place. If you haven't checked that out yet, do it today over at facebook.com/groups/rentprep. Don't forget to mention the podcast when answering the questions so we know how you found us. We're going to start things off this week with in the news segment. It's been a while since we've done one of these, and I'm kind of excited to bring this article to you because it's a particularly interesting one with a pretty obscure law being referenced. This comes to us via the Foster's Daily Democrat and was written by Karen Dandurant. Title of the article is Durham Landlord Fined for Allowing Too Many UNH Students to Rent Property Again. After the town recently received $10,000 from a local landlord who allowed too many tenants to live in a rental property, the town's fire marshal said he hopes to use the latest code violation as a teaching moment. Durham was awarded the settlement payment in a motion for contempt, a civil penalty due to a violation of a 2020 settlement by Taishi Capital Group LLC, which owns several rental properties in the town. Housing at 26 Stratford Ave, often rented to University of New Hampshire students, was found to be rented to 4 students. That's one more than the building code allows, according to Brendan O'Sullivan, the fire marshal for the Durham Fire Department. Fred Kell, manager of Taishi Capital Group in Dover, was renting the property in violation of the Durham zoning ordinance, which limits occupancy of the property to no more than 3 unrelated persons. According to town officials, Kell admitted to the violation, and Taishi Capital Group also owns properties at 14 Edgewood and 21 Edgewood Road, which at times have been overoccupied, as well as properties at 9 Dover Road and 17 to 19 Edgewood Road. Kell could not be immediately reached for comment. Audrey Klein, Durham's code enforcement officer, said that there was a similar judgment back in 2020 involving 14 Edgewood Road. In that case, Kell also admitted to overoccupancy and paid a fine of $4,929.40. He was given terms for future rentals, including providing information about the tenants to include their cars and license plate numbers. O'Sullivan said that he hopes the recent decision and fine sends a message to other property owners. The town has codes governing the use of property, and it will enforce them. If there are issues, give us a call, Sullivan said. Klein and I will try to work with you to get things back on track. We're in the business of enforcement and deterrence, not bill collection. I would prefer to resolve issues amicably. The most important code standards, O'Sullivan said, are that the town will enforce are life safety equipment such as smoke and carbon monoxide alarms, proper identification of the buildings so emergency crews can find them, compliance with fire safety codes, and that all spaces have a second means of egress, even if it's a usable window. The recent settlement agreement with Taishi Capital states that for the next 7 school years, copies of each of the leases for all 6 properties, as well as contact information for each tenant, including license plate numbers of the tenant's vehicles, will be submitted to Durham's Code Enforcement Department. The town is also entitled to 2 inspections per semester of all the properties upon 24 hours notice without cause, as well as additional inspections of any of the properties if there is cause. So that is a very, very interesting article. I have a lot to say about it, but we're going to go ahead and break it down a little bit. I find this article really interesting because they're essentially using an archaic law to police landlords and prevent them from renting to what the town feels is too many unrelated people. I also find it interesting that they are targeting this landlord in particular who rents predominantly to college students. The town is essentially using an old law in order to prevent landlords from renting to what they consider to be too many college kids. I'm betting that there were probably a lot of complaints from neighbors in the area about parties and debris and things like that, which is why the town is now enforcing it on this landlord with these tenants. We used to manage about 30 doors of student rentals in mostly single families and duplexes, and the entire neighborhood was predominantly college rentals, and it definitely looked like it, especially on Sunday mornings. So I can understand the neighborhood wanting the township to do something here, But the problem is that these laws stem from a long time ago. And honestly, there are still quite a few places with legislation like this on the books. In fact, this is actually an issue in the town where I went to college. There was an old archaic law on the books that stated that no more than, I can't remember if it was 3 or 4, unrelated women could not live together under the same roof. The law specifically cited women. I don't believe that there was a restriction on the number of unrelated men that could live in a house. And I know of several houses that had 5 or 6 guys living in them, all of which were on the lease. Here's the thing, though. No one ever enforced this law. Apparently, it's substantially easier to just ignore a law that's on the books than it is to actually remove it. So they just kind of stopped enforcing it one day. The concern was that having too many women under one roof would create a for lack of a better term. And the town absolutely did not want that to happen. So that was their solution for better or worse. And I think that's probably what happened in a lot of towns where this type of legislation exists. I think we've graduated to more reasonable mindsets at this point where these laws are no longer in a position where they make sense, and it's time to remove them from the books. A couple of other interesting items worth considering. This law flies directly in the face of the HUD guidelines regarding occupancy, which typically state 2 adults per bedroom and have additional allowances for common areas and things of that nature. Limiting occupancy to no more than 3 unrelated parties would mean a good chance of a 4 or 5 bedroom house not being able to rent for as much as it should, simply because the town is standing in the way of the landlord generating revenue from that property at full occupancy. The township is essentially artificially controlling and limiting the housing supply in this town, and I'd be curious to know if this artificial limit forces students to look for housing further from campus as the closer rentals fill up to the artificial capacity set by the town, thus spreading the so-called issue further on into other neighborhoods. I have a big issue with the last part of this article, which talks about submitting copies of the leases, contact information, plate numbers, etc. for the tenants in these buildings. I'm 100% against that. I'm not an attorney, but I feel like this is a violation of the privacy of these tenants, and I also feel like it's borderline interference in a contract. I also have a lot of concerns about the fact that the town can just decide that they want to inspect your property with 24 hours notice, and you have to permit that up to 2 times a year without cause, and then as many times as the town decides that they want to go in and take a look at it if they've determined that they have found cause, whatever cause might be. Really not a big fan of that at all. This is one of those situations that feels a lot like government overreach to me, and I would go ahead and say, no way, big brother, stay out of my house.
Forum Quorum, where we scour the internet for ridiculous posts from landlords and tenants.
Moving on to our next segment today, we have a Forum Quorum for you. This one comes from the RentPrep for Landlords Facebook group. Let's go ahead and jump right in here. I'm currently going through my first eviction. The courts have approved the eviction, and I've been told by the clerk that there are 800 evictions, and there's no way of knowing when the tenant will receive her 3-day notice to leave the property. Her lease ends April 14th. She's not responded to any calls, messages from our portal, or texts from our portal notifying her of the lease end and move out. I'm not sure if it's wishful thinking, but I'm hoping she leaves when her lease ends. Any suggestions on how to handle this situation? And again, this one comes to us via the RentPrep for Landlords Facebook group. You're in a much better position than you realize, but it's going to take some time for this one to iron out. I'm going to assume that the tenant will not leave on April 14th at the end of their lease term. They've already been through the full eviction process, and they're likely not going to leave at the end of the lease, but they're going to wait until the very, very bitter end of this to be out of the apartment. Unfortunately, there was no state referenced in the post, so I'm going to explain my experiences here in Western New York, particularly inside the city of Buffalo. So I say that you're in a better position than you realize because you are already in line for your set out. I understand that there are a lot of people in line ahead of you, but the longer that you delay getting in line, the longer you have to wait for your set out. So just being in line at this point is a good spot to be in. Assuming that the tenant moves out on April 14th, at that point, contact your attorney to see if they recommend canceling the set out appointment or if they recommend seeing it all the way through to the finish line, even with the tenant being removed from the property. Different states will have different laws on when you can actually reclaim the unit. So it's worth finding out if you can reclaim it once the tenant moves out or if you do need to finalize that eviction process by having the set out completed. Pretty much every court is going to have some sort of delay between the time that you file for your set out and the time that the set out actually happens. It's going to be different in pretty much every court, but here in Western New York, it seems to take somewhere between 15 and 30 days for most set outs to occur once you've paid to have that set out completed. Some states will actually dictate a minimum amount of time that has to elapse before a set out can actually occur. So you're going to want to check your state laws and find out if you have any restrictions like that you have to deal with. Here in Buffalo, once we've been through eviction court and win the eviction case, the judge will typically issue a warrant for the set out, and there's a date listed on that warrant that states that it cannot be executed before that date. We then have to call the city marshal service the morning before the warrant is allowed to execute, provide them with the docket number, and then call back in that afternoon to find out what time the marshal service can meet us at the property the following day. On the day of the set out, we arrive at the property and meet with the marshal on site. We approach the apartment along with the marshal, and the marshal knocks on the door to see if anyone actually comes to the door or if anyone's even still residing in the property. If someone answers, he tells them that they need to leave the premises and that they've been evicted, and he'll typically give them a few minutes to grab some of their belongings. And if no one answers, we either key into the apartment or drill out the lock if the tenants have changed the locks on us. And then we walk through the property with the marshal to actually verify that no one is remaining inside. At that point, we can rekey the property and check on all the other windows and doors to ensure that those are locked and the property is secure. And then there's also some laws in our state with regards to disposal of tenant belongings. So the tenant stuff either needs to be packed and moved to a storage unit for a period of time or held inside the unit for a period of time before we can dispose of it. But as far as the actual set out itself goes, that's considered complete and the unit is considered back in our possession once the marshals have come to the property for the set out and post notice on the door stating that the eviction process has been completed and that the former tenants are no longer allowed to occupy the unit. So my recommendation is to continue handling the situation exactly as you have been. Check the unit after the end of the lease to see if they're still living in it. And if they are still living in the unit, follow through with having them set out of the unit just as soon as you get to the top of the list. Being on the list is already a good thing because at least you're moving up the list as time progresses. And my honest recommendation here is to probably continue all the way through the set out phase, even if the tenant leaves early, because then there's no question that they have been officially evicted from the apartment. Good luck, and hopefully your unit isn't damaged too badly once you get it back.
Water cooler wisdom. Expert advice from real estate pros.
Our final segment this week is our water cooler wisdom segment. This one also comes to us via the RentPrep for Landlords Facebook group. Let's go ahead and dive right in here. Hi, everyone. I'm looking to rent my second property out to someone who's been in the military. Their monthly income is lower than my required minimum gross income amount. However, they told me they get VA disability and VA education pay for the rest of their income. Is there a good way to verify this income? Thank you for your help. And again, this one comes to us from the RentPrep for Landlords Facebook group. So VA disability pay can be verified from a VA benefit letter, which is issued to the vet by the VA office once they're awarded their disability rating. The vet can actually manage their VA disability pay online, which includes getting a copy of their benefits letter as well as a copy of their payment history, which is probably what you're going to want to use for the actual income verification. They can also do things like change their direct deposit information and quite a bit more from the VA's website. You can request a copy of the benefit letter and or a copy of their payment history, which would probably be the easiest way to verify this income. If they're using direct deposit, you can also verify the deposits from their bank statements. It's also worth noting that VA disability is tax-free at the federal level and also at most state levels. So keep that in mind while you're completing your income verification. And finally, I want to make a note that this income is considered very, very, very consistent and almost never changes. And if it does change, typically it only goes up on a yearly basis as cost of living goes up. Now, VA education benefits, commonly referred to as the GI Bill, work pretty similarly. There are a couple of other programs out there that are less common and predominantly used by older vets, but the verification process is going to be very, very similar. The vet can download a copy of their VA education benefit letter online, probably through that same portal, as well as a copy of the payment history for the VA education benefit. These benefits come to the bank account of the vet as a cash deposit, and they're not specifically earmarked towards school or towards housing or something along those lines. It's considered cash money that they can use however they see fit, which in theory should be used for educational purposes, including housing. When you're doing a verification on the education benefit, you really need to get a copy of the payment history. In doing research for this segment, I spoke with a vet who's also a client of mine, and they explained to me that the education benefit is very, very inconsistent. First, the benefit is only paid while the vet is actively taking classes. The benefit changes depending on whether the vet is full-time student or a part-time student, and will also change if they go from full-time to part-time or part-time to full-time at any point during their education. The program does not pay out during breaks, including short breaks such as winter recesses and things of that nature. But if the vet is not enrolled in classes during the summer semester, for instance, then they're not getting any of this education benefit deposited into their bank account during that time frame. And the program also pays out different amounts based on the length of service, the location that the vet is going to school, and several other factors. So just getting a copy of the benefit letter would not be enough in this circumstance. You're going to want to get a copy of the payment history as well, so that you can see what the vet is actually receiving on a monthly basis. This is probably one of the more complicated forms of income to verify, but once you get a hold of the actual payment history, it makes it a lot easier to take a look at everything as a whole. And that would be my recommendation in both instances, would be get not only the benefit letter, but also a copy of the payment history. You've heard about tenant screening, but have you ever heard about pet screening? You can run a background check on your tenants' pets just like you can on renters. Find out everything you need to know about pet screening today in our latest guide. You can find that over at rentprep.com/blog. That pretty much wraps up this episode of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. Thank you all so much for listening. We truly do appreciate it. Our goal with the podcast is to help as many people as possible make educated decisions when it comes to real estate, and you can help us to reach our goal. If you heard anything in this week's episode or any of our other episodes that will help someone that you know, please do us a favor and share it with them. If you're looking to get in contact with me, I can be reached over at whatsdrewupto.com. From there, you'll find links to everything going on with me over at Own Buffalo, as well as other projects that we're working on. Don't forget to grab a free copy of our deal analysis tool today over at whatsdrewupto.com. There's no obligation, and it comes with a companion video to show you how to use it. If you're looking for top-tier tenant screening services, head on over to rentprep.com. There are multiple products to choose from, including tenant-paid options. And if you're over 50 doors, ask about the enterprise-level programs and pricing. I've been an enterprise user of RentPrep for over a decade now, and it's definitely changed the way that we screen our tenants. Check that out today over at rentprep.com. Again, thank you all so much for listening. We'll be back in a couple weeks with an all-new episode that you won't want to miss. Until then, I'm Andrew Schultz with ownbuffalo.com for rentprep.com, and we'll talk to you soon.